On August 1st, 1947, two Army Air Force intelligence officers loaded fragments of an alleged flying saucer onto their B-25 and took off from Tacoma, Washington. They never made it home. They died in a fiery crash. And the investigation that led to their deaths traces back to an unlikely source, the editor of a pulp science fiction magazine, Ray Palmer.
This is WOR Radio. We're talking with Mr. Ray Palmer. Ray Palmer is the editor and publisher of Flying Saucers from Other Worlds. He is the former editor of Amazing Stories. And he has with him Richard Shaver, is the author of the famous Shaver Mysteries.
Hello, Richard. These underground sort of caverns, right, that are inhabited by the Zeros.
They're practically worldwide.
Do they go under the oceans?
Some of them do. There are passages under the ocean, yes. Ray, we don't want to get away from the Shaver Mysteries, but I want to take just a moment to ask you about a couple of things as far as flying saucers are concerned. All right. Did you present the Shaver Mysteries as being true stories? Yes, I did. Do you still believe that they're true stories? I know it now.
In part one, we watched a 4-foot-tall editor named Ray Palmer transform a failing science fiction magazine, Amazing Stories, into the best-selling pulp in America. His weapon was the Shaver Mystery, a series of stories by a Pennsylvania welder named Richard Shaver, who claimed that they weren't fiction at all, but rather true testimony, underground civilizations, ancient technology, telepathic rays, an elder race that fled to the stars in spaceships but might return. And in June 1947, it looked like they had. Between March 1945 and early 1947, Palmer used the Shaver Mystery to build something unprecedented. A participatory mythology with its own discourse community, its own research network, and its own canon of supporting texts. His readers were not only enjoying stories about underground civilizations and strange aerial phenomena, they were also reporting them. And through the parallel work of Meade Lane's Borderline Sciences Research Association, an occult organization in Southern California, the first framework for understanding these phenomena as interdimensional rather than physical or extraterrestrial was already taking shape. By early 1947, every component of what would become the modern UFO phenomenon was already in circulation in the pages of Amazing Stories and Lane's Round Robin newsletter. Sightings of anomalous aircraft, crash retrievals, underground bases, government knowledge and suppression, the extraterrestrial hypothesis, the interdimensional hypothesis, the crypto-terrestrial hypothesis. All of it, waiting for something to fly through the skies and validate it. But Palmer's own publisher was about to pull the plug. The Shaver Mystery had made Amazing Stories the best-selling science fiction magazine in America. But it had also made enemies. Throughout 1946, criticism had been building in the science fiction fanzines. Individual fans and fan organizations were pushing back hard. The Shaver Mystery was an embarrassment to their beloved genre. But the real blow came from outside the science fiction world entirely. In September 1946, Harper's Magazine published a scathing article by William Baring-Gould, ranking the science fiction magazines. Astounding was praised as highbrow and intellectual. Amazing Stories was placed at the bottom of the list, singled out for the Shaver Mystery. This wasn't fans complaining in mimeograph zines. This was Harper's Magazine, and it sullied the Ziff Davis brand. Word reached William Ziff at his suite in the Chatham Hotel in New York. The Harper's article, the fan letters, Harold Brown, Palmer's own assistant editor, bending Ziff's ear, trying to throw Palmer under the bus. The critics were calling Palmer a con man running a hoax on his readers. But Palmer was also making them a fortune. William Hamling, another assistant editor who was caught in the middle of it, later put it bluntly. Astounding Science Fiction had 80,000 readers. Ziff Davis had 3 or 4 times that through Palmer and the Shaver Mystery. Ziff could read numbers, and they spelled dollars. So Ziff looked the other way, and Palmer doubled down in his editorial column, declaring on the record that he believed the Shaver mystery was legitimate, that it was neither a hoax on his part nor Shaver's, and predicting that their current circulation would be peanuts compared to what was coming. But the pressure didn't stop. Eventually, Ziff and partner Bernard Davis conferred and delivered the directive. Palmer could continue publishing Shaver's stories, but only as fiction. The ambiguity between fact and fiction that had been the engine of the entire enterprise was to be shut down. Palmer understood that compliance meant the end of his cash cow. The Shaver mystery's power lay precisely in the claim that it wasn't fiction, or at least in the ambiguity that it wasn't entirely fiction. His solution was characteristically subversive. He announced the creation of the Shaver Mystery Club, supposedly a grassroots fan organization with its own monthly magazine containing material too potent for a newsstand publication. Palmer contributed $250. Shaver contributed $1,000. The announcement letter, published in Amazing, radiated grassroots enthusiasm. In reality, Palmer had written it himself and assigned a Ziff Davis writer named Chester Geyer to run the operation. Geyer later described it as a shotgun wedding with Palmer holding the shotgun. The club wasn't exactly an escalation of the Shaver mystery. It was more like an evacuation. Palmer was moving the living core of the Shaver mystery out of Ziff Davis's editorial control. The June 1947 issue was devoted entirely to Shaver material. It was the last significant dump of the Shaver mystery in Amazing Stories. The stories would continue for another year or so, sporadically, but without the enthusiasm and, importantly, framed purely as fiction. Palmer had lost his godsend, his cash cow. The phenomenon that had made him the most successful editor in science fiction had been taken away by his own publisher. He needed something new. And he was about to get it. On June 24, 1947, a private pilot and businessman named Kenneth Arnold was flying his Cal Air near Mount Rainier, Washington. He was searching for a downed Marine transport plane when he spotted something else entirely. 9 objects moving in formation at extraordinary speed, weaving between the peaks of the Cascades. Arnold described their movement as erratic, like a saucer skipped across water. A reporter's paraphrase gave the phenomenon its name: flying saucers. Within days, sightings were reported across 34 states. The press went into a frenzy. The military scrambled to respond, and the American public was introduced to a mystery that hasn't gone away in almost 80 years. A couple of weeks later, something happened near Roswell, New Mexico, that would eventually become even more famous. But at the time, the Roswell incident was barely a footnote, reported briefly, quickly explained as a weather balloon, and then forgotten for 30 years until researchers rediscovered it in the late 1970s. But that's a story for another day. In fact, if you'd like me to do a deep dive on the flying saucer explosion in the summer of 1947, let me know in the comments. That would actually make a great episode. Meade Lane's response to the flying saucer wave was immediate. Within days of Arnold's sighting, he convened a sitting with medium Mark Probert. The channeler's message was unequivocal. When will you people learn that there are worlds within worlds, that the etheric worlds interpenetrate with your plane and with each other? The flying saucers weren't constructed on Earth. They didn't come from another planet. They were etheric constructions that materialized on entering the vibratory rate of dense matter and could dematerialize at will. They came from the lokas, a term drawn from Hindu cosmology for planes of existence that interpenetrate with the physical but are imperceptible to human senses. Lane connected it back to the Kurita incident of October 1946 that we discussed in Part 1. The Kurita had been an experimental scout ship. The flying saucers were the full deployment. On July 8th, 14 days after Arnold, Lane formalized his hypothesis in a memorandum addressed to scientists, military authorities, and the FBI. He identified himself by his academic credentials, stated that he had little expectation of being taken seriously, and laid out the core claims as actionable intelligence. The flying discs carried crews. Their mission was peaceful. They came from an etheric planet interpenetrating with our own. And if attacked, the attacking plane would almost certainly be destroyed. That same day, Lane's ideas reached a Berkeley newspaper through a reader who quoted him almost verbatim in a letter to the editor, where the etheric hypothesis was sandwiched between jokes about flying coffee cups. On a single day, the interdimensional hypothesis was formally presented to federal law enforcement and publicly ridiculed in a newspaper. That's a familiar pattern that would hold for decades. Palmer saw something very different in the flying saucers. Where Lane saw etheric constructions from the locals, Palmer saw his salvation. The Shaver mystery rug had been pulled out from under him. His publisher had shut him down. But Kenneth Arnold's sighting gave him a new godsend. He could pivot from underground civilizations to flying saucers. He initially framed the flying saucers as confirmation of the Shaver mystery. The flying saucers were Shaver's elder race going back and forth between their home planets and the subterranean caves. But he was already thinking bigger. Flying saucers could be their own thing, a new phenomenon with a new audience, or at least the old audience turned in a new direction. Palmer's editorial in the October 1947 issue was triumphant. A portion of the famous Shaver mystery has now been proved. He claimed exclusive credit. He revealed he'd been sitting on reports of disc-shaped craft for years. And then he dropped the connection he'd been holding in reserve. He pointed readers back to the W.C. Heffernan article about a circle-winged plane from the September 1946 issue, and revealed that Heffernan claimed membership in an organization headquartered in a city under the South Pole, Rainbow City, where ancient technology was preserved by a super civilization. He connected flying saucers to Hefferland's circular aircraft, to Rainbow City, and even to Admiral Byrd's Antarctic Expedition Operation High Jump. If you watch my video on the Emerald Tablets and the Serpent People, some of this will sound familiar. The Hefferland manuscripts and their connection to Maurice Doreal and the Serpent Race are all a part of the same web of ideas Palmer was weaving together. Link in the description if you want to go deeper on that thread. In a single editorial, Palmer had assembled the complete Antarctic UFO-based mythology that would persist for decades. And he was already planning something much bigger. He began organizing an all-flying saucer issue of amazing stories. He wanted first-hand accounts of the summer's most prominent witnesses. He hired Kenneth Arnold himself. He hired Captain E.J. Smith, the United Airlines pilot whose July 4th sighting over Idaho had made him the second most famous witness of the summer. And he had one more lead to chase down, a man named Fred Chrisman, who had been in Palmer's orbit since the anonymous letter he wrote back in June of 1946. We talked about this in part 1. It described subterranean battles with the Darrows. And he'd contacted Palmer again. This time it wasn't about the caves. It was about donut-shaped objects over Puget Sound. On July 21st, 1947, 3 days before Arnold's sighting, a man named Harold Dahl claimed to have witnessed donut-shaped objects over Puget Sound near Maury Island. One of the craft had reportedly dropped molten slag that killed Dahl's dog and injured his son. The morning after the sighting, Dahl claimed a man in a dark suit visited him and warned him not to discuss what he had seen. That account would enter UFO literature as the first Men in Black encounter. Palmer wanted this story for his all-flying saucer issue. He sent Arnold to Tacoma to investigate, accompanied by Captain Smith. Arnold and Smith met with Chrisman and Dahl in a Tacoma hotel room. They quickly suspected something was wrong. Details of their private discussions were appearing in a local newspaper almost in real time. Someone was monitoring their conversations. Alarmed, Arnold called in 2 Army Air Force intelligence officers from Hamilton Field, California, Captain William Davidson and Lieutenant Frank Brown. They examined the alleged fragments Chrisman had provided. They loaded samples onto their B-25, and on August 1st, they departed Tacoma. The plane caught fire and crashed near Kelso, Washington. Both officers were killed. The supposed flying saucer fragments were never recovered. The aftermath was devastating to everyone involved. Samples of the material that had been sent to Palmer were sent to a laboratory and identified as ordinary industrial slag. Under FBI questioning, Chrisman and Dahl attempted to deflect blame onto Palmer, claiming the whole affair had been his idea. The FBI then visited the Ziff Davis offices in Chicago and interviewed William Ziff and Bernard Davis directly about Palmer's role. They also interviewed Palmer and Shaver. The Bureau's conclusion was damning. They wrote that Palmer had been exploiting the flying discs to enhance the appeal of Shaver's stories, and that, quote, "It's possible that the entire flying disc theory was conceived by Palmer and Shaver," end quote. Think about that for a moment. The FBI now held in its filing cabinets the conclusion that the editor of a pulp science fiction magazine may have conceived the entire flying saucer phenomenon. Most investigators concluded that Maury Island was a hoax, and the chain of connections was undeniable. Crispin had entered Palmer's orbit through a letter to Amazing Stories in June of 1946. The donut-shaped craft echoed Hefferland's circular wing design from September 1946. Palmer had directed the investigation using his two most prominent witnesses, and now 2 military intelligence officers were dead. The first physical evidence case in UFO history, the first Men in Black account, the first investigator deaths, all traced back to the network Ray Palmer had built through a pulp science fiction magazine. For William Ziff and Bernard Davis, it was the last straw. The Harper's article, the fan revolt, and now the FBI in their offices asking about dead intelligence officers. Around the same time, at the end of August, the 5th World Science Fiction Convention, PhilCon, convened in Philadelphia. The organized science fiction community passed a formal resolution denouncing the Shaver mystery as, quote, "a serious threat to the mental health of many people," end quote. It was a line-by-line repudiation of the mystery's basic tenets, followed by a list of approved science fiction magazines. As you can imagine, Amazing Stories was not on the list. The PhilCon resolution and the FBI investigation hit Ziff Davis simultaneously. The science fiction community was publicly disowning Palmer at their annual convention at the exact same time federal agents were questioning his bosses about a hoax that killed 2 men. Palmer's planned all-flying saucer issue was squashed. The directive came down from Ziff himself. No more Shaver mystery, no more flying saucers. Publish normal science fiction stories and stay in your lane. Palmer's response? He published the PhilCon resolution verbatim in the January 1948 issue of Amazing Stories, and he used it as an opportunity to attack his critics. He called it a declaration of war meant to banish all Ziff Davis publications from fandom. And the FBI investigation? He treated it as validation. If the government was interested, he must be onto something. He was not doing a very good job of reading the room. Or maybe he was reading a different room entirely. Because by then, Palmer already had an escape plan. Through the autumn of 1947, Palmer had been renting a second office in Chicago. During his long lunch breaks from Ziff Davis, he would slip away to work on a new publication. His colleague, Frank Robinson, who later co-authored The Towering Inferno, remembered it plainly. According to Robinson, the long lunch hours at Ziff Davis turned into work sessions at another office close by. Everyone in Palmer's inner circle knew what he was doing. William Hamling knew, Robinson knew, Chester Geyer knew. The only people who didn't know were William Ziff and Bernard Davis. Palmer recruited Curtis Fuller, a Ziff Davis editor for Flying Magazine, as his partner. Fuller was genuinely interested in the flying saucer craze and had a number of Air Force connections through his magazine. Together, they established Clark Publishing, and Palmer began producing the flying saucer issue that Ziff Davis wouldn't let him publish. In a new magazine, under the pseudonym Robert N. Webster, in the spring of 1948, the first issue of Fate magazine appeared on the newsstands. The cover featured Kenneth Arnold's own first-hand account of his Mount Rainier sighting. Arnold contributed an article describing his sighting, as well as his investigation of the Maury Island incident. The second issue featured another article by Arnold, discussing all of the other famous flying saucer events of 1947 and early 1948. The stories that were supposed to fill Palmer's canceled all-flying saucer issue of Amazing Stories had become the launch content for Fate instead. Fate would become a major hub for early UFO discussion, along with other topics that Amazing had been promoting during Palmer's tenure: ancient mysteries, the paranormal, fringe science, high strangeness, and so on. The material Ziff Davis suppressed became the foundation of a popular new magazine that's still being published today. Palmer stayed on the Amazing Stories masthead for another 2 years, turning day-to-day editing over to Hamling while he built his independent operation in secret. He didn't formally resign from Ziff Davis until December 1949, and he didn't reveal that he was Robert N. Webster until he appeared at the World Science Fiction Convention in September of that year. By then, 8 issues of Fate had already been published. Palmer arranged for 2 more publishing projects that would cement the legacy of everything that he had built. In 1948, he published I Remember Lemuria and the Return of Sathanas, a hardcover edition of the 2 novellas that featured Mutan Mian, the original protagonist of the Shaver mystery, extracted from their pulp origins and given the permanence of a limited edition hardback. This is one of only 2 copies I've ever seen in the original plain green dust jacket, which I'm going to remove here carefully so that you guys can see the actual cover. So this was essentially canonizing the Shaver mystery in hardback for collectors that wanted to have a nice edition on the shelves. And later, in 1952, he would do the same thing with Kenneth Arnold, co-authoring The Coming of the Saucers. Palmer here publishing the man whose sighting had validated his framework in a book they produced together. The architect of the framework and the man who proved it, bound between the same covers. From Amherst, Wisconsin, Palmer would spend the next 3 decades editing magazine after magazine. Fate, Other Worlds, Mystic, Search, and eventually Flying Saucers from Other Worlds, which became very influential in the late 50s and early 60s, promoting the flying saucer and UFO phenomenon. He remained a central figure in flying saucer culture really up until his death in 1977. And what about Richard Shaver, the man whose letters started all of this? After Palmer left Ziff Davis, Shaver continued writing and publishing his own. The Shaver Mystery Club newsletter, originally created as Palmer's escape vehicle, passed to Shaver himself. He ran his own publications intermittently for years, his voice increasingly unmediated by Palmer's editorial shaping. In the early 60s, Palmer published The Hidden World, a series of digests presenting Shaver's unedited testimony. So Palmer and Shaver were back together again. But Palmer had little editorial control over it. This was raw Shaver, urgent, paranoid, brilliantly creative at times, largely incoherent at others. Without Palmer's narrative framing, you can hear the original voice that sent that letter from a Pennsylvania welding shop back in 1943. Palmer had taken a disturbed man's genuine experiences, whatever their actual cause, and turned them into the most influential publishing phenomenon in science fiction history. Shaver believed every word until the day he died. Whether that makes him a delusional visionary or a victim of Palmer's exploitation, or something of both, depends entirely on what you think was actually happening to him in that auto plant in Detroit. Mead Lane self-published The Ethership Mystery and Its Solution in 1950, one of the earliest books devoted to the flying saucer phenomenon, and incredibly rare today. But it was the first book to present a fully developed interdimensional hypothesis. He followed it in 1954 with The Coming of the Guardians, further elaborating on his interdimensional beings. The framework he articulated in Round Robin in 1946 and 1947 and codified in The Ethership Mystery and Coming of the Guardians would be rediscovered and expanded on by John Keel and Jacques Vallée in the late 1960s and 1970s, and it's become a core component of the modern UAP disclosure movement. The Hefferland manuscripts migrated to Lane's Borderland Sciences network, where they circulated as typewritten copies describing Rainbow City and the eternal conflict with the Serpent Race. The Antarctic UFO-based tradition that persists to this day, Nazi bases, Hollow Earth theories, Operation High Jump conspiracies, all of it, traces back to these documents first introduced in the pages of Amazing Stories. In 1970, John Keel called Ray Palmer the man who invented flying saucers. Believers have dismissed that claim. Skeptics have ignored it for the most part. What the primary sources reveal is something more interesting than either side allows. Palmer didn't invent flying saucers, he couldn't have, but across 28 months of pulp publishing, he assembled the interpretive framework through which the phenomenon would be understood for generations. 3 competing interpretive frameworks for the flying saucer phenomenon were fully articulated in Amazing Stories before Kenneth Arnold ever looked up over Mount Rainier. Palmer and Shaver offered a hybrid model. Physical craft operated by descendants of an alien elder race, some of whom had gone underground and others who had left for the stars but continued to visit Earth in spaceships. Simultaneously extraterrestrial and cryptoterrestrial. Lane offered a purely interdimensional hypothesis, etheric constructions materializing from the locas, planes of existence imperceptible to human senses. The Hefferlands offered a purely cryptoterrestrial hypothesis, a hidden race using ancient technology based underground at Rainbow City in Antarctica. The debate between these 3 frameworks, extraterrestrial, cryptoterrestrial, and interdimensional, which still form the central argument in ufology almost 80 years later, was not generated by the evidence of the flying saucer sightings. It preceded the sightings. The frameworks were built in the pages of Amazing Stories and Round Robin between 1945 and 1947. The saucers merely gave them something to argue about. In December 2017, the New York Times reported on the Pentagon's Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. The flying saucer, rebranded as UFOs originally and now rebranded again as the UAP, Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon, returned to mainstream discourse with an intensity not seen since 1947. Congressional hearings, whistleblower testimony, institutional acknowledgement. The question Palmer posed to his readers in 1946, whether responsible parties and world governments are ignorant of the fact of spaceships visiting Earth, is being asked again in almost the same words by United States senators. And now, in May 2026, when this is being recorded, we have the Pentagon and other agencies supposedly beginning to release all of their UFO files. The discourse Ray Palmer constructed in the pages of a 25-cent pulp magazine has proven more durable than anyone, perhaps even including Palmer himself, could have anticipated. If you want to go deeper on Ray Palmer and the Shaver mystery, I'd recommend 2 books in particular. The first is Richard Toronto's War over Lemuria. This is the definitive account of the Shaver mystery from the inside. Toronto had access to Palmer and Shaver's personal correspondence, and he tells the story in extraordinary detail. It was one of my primary sources for this video. And also, Fred Nadis's The Man from Mars is the best biography of Palmer himself, covering his entire life story and career from the days of first fandom in the 1930s through the flying saucer era and beyond. And the written version of this 2-part episode will be appearing as a print article this summer in the 2026 issue of the Pulpster magazine. And I'll also be giving a presentation on it at the annual Pulp Fest convention in Pittsburgh in August. Check the description for the links. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, check out my other videos, including the one on the Emerald Tablets and the origins of the reptilian conspiracy theory, which has connections to the Shaver mystery. And be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps small channels like this keep doing what they do. Thanks to all of you, and I'll see you next time on An Age Undreamed Of.